So the thing we're talking about today, we can see from the cartoon, references fruit flies again, and this is funny. One says to the other, live like you're gonna die tomorrow, Gus, but we're fruit flies, so it's true. It's true. They make it a whole day, actually. It's pretty amazing. We are going to talk a little bit more today about sex-linked inheritance, and specifically the work of Thomas Morgan. He's come up before. This isn't the first time we've heard his name. He's the guy who said genes are on chromosomes, and so his name came up before. We mentioned him very briefly in the section on DNA, and we mentioned him when we talked about those linked genes in our class on Thursday. But now this is really his bread and butter here, this sex-linked inheritance. Where did my mouse go? Oh, this is fun. So if you want to look in the either physical or digital textbook, remember we're in chapter 17, and there's a bunch of diagrams on page 601 that show all the different crosses that he did. They also have pictures of like cartoony fruit flies and their gross, weird red and white colored eyes. But he was doing a lot of research with these fruit flies, Drosophila. That's the genus of their scientific name. That's why it's in cursive and it has a capital. It's from Bio30E. And while he was studying fruit flies, he didn't actually know he was studying sex-linked traits. That was something he found out as like a fun side thing. But what's important to note first is that in these fruit flies, males have an X and a Y chromosome, and females have two X chromosomes, much like in humans. And it's important to note that because the way sex-linked inheritance works really depends on which sex chromosomes organisms that are male or organisms that are female have. Now, one of the traits that's widely studied, I even did this in university, was the color of the fruit fly's eyes. You probably remember me telling you this. It was very annoying. You had to like not let the fruit flies out of the container, but also not accidentally kill all of them, both of which were kind of hard to do. There is a gene that is attached to the X chromosome. So when something is X-linked, we mean that it is a gene on the X chromosome. Now you'll notice that as we go through this, basically all of the sex-linked traits are on the X chromosome. It's because the Y chromosome is super tiny and doesn't have a lot of stuff on it. I will talk about Y-linked traits, but it's certainly not the more prevalent thing. Now notice I didn't say that this gene that's on the X chromosome, or I didn't tell you about the alleles for the gene yet. So for the eye color, these are the two alleles that we know exist. The way we represent sex-linked traits is to write the X or the Y to show which chromosome they're attached to. And then we use a little superscript like we did before to indicate which allele is on which sex chromosome. So if you take a look here, I'm still using a capital letter for the dominant allele, and I'm still using a lowercase letter for the recessive allele. So in fruit flies, the dominant allele is on the gene that is on the X chromosome is for red eyes. Sometimes you'll see questions that don't refer to this as red, they'll just call it normal type because that's like the default typical regular color. And these white eyes are the recessive trait. So if you ever run into a question that says normal type, red eyes is often referred to as that. Now what's interesting is that for a male or a female to have red or white eyes, the chromosome and gene arrangement is slightly different. Males have X and Y chromosomes. So if I represent their sex chromosomes, and I want to discuss whether or not they're going to have white or red eyes. For a male fruit fly to have white eyes, it needs to have the recessive allele. So I'm going to put the little r on the X chromosome. Since males only have one X chromosome, they only need one copy of the recessive allele. So this is different than regular autosomal inheritance where you needed 2 copies of the recessive allele to have the recessive trait. For a male to have red eyes, on its one X chromosome, it has to have the dominant allele. So for males, it's pretty straightforward. Whatever is on their X chromosome, that's the trait that they have. But females have a bit of a different scenario. Females have 2 X chromosomes. So for a female to have the recessive trait of white eyes, she has to have 2 copies of that recessive allele. So both of her X chromosomes have to have the recessive allele. If one of her X chromosomes didn't and had the dominant allele, that's the trait that would show up. So for a female to have, oh, that's not what I was writing. Okay, well, let's just pretend I didn't draw that. For a female to have red eyes, then there are 2 choices. She could be homozygous. I'm going to try writing over here. No, that doesn't work. How about over here? There we go. Let's just pretend this is over there where it says red, where I can't seem to write. The female could be homozygous for the dominant allele for red eyes, but she could also be heterozygous. She could have 1 copy of each. The gene for eye color shows complete dominance, so that means when the organism is heterozygous, they only display the dominant trait, so they have the dominant phenotype. And so what this means is that it's a little less probable that a female is going to end up with white eyes, right? She has to get 2 copies of an X chromosome with that recessive allele. And so, depending on what the parents have, they both have to have passed that on to her. She has a better chance of having red eyes because there are 2 different genotypes that would end up giving her red eyes. So I'm going to show you a couple of crosses that will help illustrate how things are different when you have a sex-linked trait. Now, so far, does anyone want to ask anything here? So we're going to do 2 crosses to sort of illustrate the difference in the way things are inherited. In the first cross, we're going to take a red female and a red male and cross them. In the second cross, we're going to take a homozygous red female and a white male and cross them. So the first thing we got to do, this is working, like in any cross, is to decide what the parents' genotypes and phenotypes are. So the question gave me some information for the first cross. It said I have a heterozygous red female. Now, because we know this is a sex-linked trait, I need to represent sex chromosomes, and that is super important. You don't want to just represent these with R's and forget about the X and the Y, because they're very important. So I'm going to make sure I represent my female with 2 X chromosomes. Sorry, my SmartBoard is not letting me write where I think I am. She's heterozygous, so it means she has 1 dominant and 1 recessive allele. The male is red, and we just said on the previous slide that for a male to have red eyes, he of course has an X and a Y chromosome, and then that's a capital R. Then he's going to have the dominant allele on his X chromosome. So that came from the previous slide. Now, if you take a look at these 2 parents, both of them have red eyes. And so you might think, well, there's a pretty low chance that the offspring are going to have white eyes. That seems fairly unlikely since both parents have red eyes. And what you're going to see is that the chances of having red or white eyes will be different depending on if the offspring is male or female. So when we report our phenotypic ratios at the end for a sex-linked trait, instead of just reporting what probability that they'll have red eyes or what probability they'll have white eyes, we're also going to include another sort of line for, and which sex is the organism? Are they male or female? And is the chance for a male or a female different? Now, when we put our stuff on the outside of our Punnett square, that's going to work the same way. So you can go ahead and do this cross with me. Sorry, I'm going to try to Okay. Oh, well, that's fun. Let's try this again. Hopefully this works now. No? Okay. I'm going to go ahead and write this on the whiteboard because it is not writing on the since I don't have to write on the SmartBoard. The Y-linked or Ylinked traits are ones that are on the Y chromosome. And so like I mentioned before, only males have Y chromosomes. Females don't have them. Males inherit their Y chromosomes only from their fathers. They don't get them from their mother. And so if a father has a trait that is Y-linked, so will all of his sons. And like, I use the word all. I don't do that a lot, but that's the way it should work. All of his sons have to get his Y chromosome. That's how they become his son and not his daughter necessarily. So they're getting his Y chromosome, so they're getting whatever traits are attached to genes on that Y chromosome. You'll also notice that I didn't say anything about traits being dominant or recessive. Anyone know why? It doesn't matter? Yeah.
Because you already have.
I feel like you maybe were on the
Is it
right
like-
track.
Like the X chromosome already determines it?
Oh, I see what you're going to say. It's actually not necessarily because the X chromosome already determined a trait. There are some traits that are just attached to the Y chromosome. Not a ton of them, but there are some. And so the reason here is because you only ever have one Y chromosome. It doesn't matter if an allele is dominant or recessive because there won't be a second copy to dominate the first one. In other scenarios, we needed to consider dominant and recessive alleles because you had two of everything. But in this specific case of the Y-linked trait, you're only ever getting one, so it doesn't really matter if it's dominant or recessive because nothing will be there to mask that trait. Now, because this is the way it works, there's not a lot of Punnett squares around where you predict the outcome of a Y-linked trait. There's also not that many Y-linked traits like in real life. And so whenever there is a Y-linked trait, you would set up your Punnett square the same as with an X-linked trait. The only difference being you would attach the little letter to the Y instead of to the X. Now, does anyone want to ask anything about that one? Whoops. That was my last thing there. Get out of here. There we go. So there's one more thing I want to tell you about, and it's something called a bar body. We will talk about this again when we talk about reproduction, kind of near the end of the course, because this is one of the ways that sex determination, especially for participation in sport, has been accomplished in the past. It's not the main test that's used currently, but it was at one point. And it's about something called a bar body. And so I have a picture of a super cute, it's just a stuffy, of a calico or tortoiseshell cat. It's adorable. And I'm using them because they are a good example of bar bodies in action. Now, I told you before when we talked about non-disjunction causing chromosomal syndromes like Down syndrome, that an extra or missing chromosome will cause a really serious and often fatal genetic disorder. But when stuff is linked to the X chromosome, not necessarily. There were a couple of different syndromes. One of them was Klinefelter syndrome that I would have mentioned in the notes, where we have two X's and a Y. It was one of the syndromes that one of the people had in our little karyotyping activity. And so sometimes when stuff is attached to the X chromosome, having an extra or missing X chromosome doesn't cause as big of a chance for fatality as maybe one of those autosomes. And here's why. Females only have one active X chromosome in each cell. They have two, but in each cell, only one of them is active. The inactive one is condensed into a structure called a bar body. And this structure is what at one point was used as a test to determine if a person who was applying or trying out to be an athlete in a female competition, especially at things like the Olympics, was actually a female person, because sometimes that could be in question. And so at one point, they would do a little test and check to see if the participant had a bar body in each of her cells. Now, hopefully you see the flaw with that. A person could be female and missing an X chromosome and other stuff could be happening. And we'll talk about all of the different possibilities that exist. But in your typical female, that's the scenario. She has 2 X chromosomes, but in each cell, only one of them is active. And so the one that's active in these calico cats will determine which color of fur is displayed. Sometimes the X chromosome will have a gene that will code for orange fur. Sometimes it will have a gene that codes for black fur. There are other colors of fur besides that, but those are your typical colors that you see in those calico cats. And so it's determined by chance. And so there's not really a factor that we know of anyways at this point that decides in each cell which X chromosome is active. So if there's a trait that's linked to the X chromosome, it could show up differently in different parts of the body depending on which X chromosome is active. So the calico cat has both colors of fur. And so, oh yeah, that's right. I can't write on the SmartBoard.